The gunshots echoed through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, Colorado, as Prudence Miller ran for her life, clutching her medical bag in one hand and the hem of her skirt in the other. Spring of 1875 had brought more than just wildflowers to this frontier town. It had brought trouble in the form of the Blackwell Gang. And now they were after her simply because she'd refused to treat their leader's gunshot wound without payment first. There she goes. A gruff voice shouted behind her as Prudence ducked into an alley, her heart hammering against her ribs. The young doctor had come west with dreams of establishing herself where female physicians were scarce. But after 6 months in Redemption Creek, she'd learned the hard way that frontier life was even more dangerous than Boston had warned. Men in these parts viewed her either as a curiosity, a potential bride, or in the Blackwell Gang's case, someone to be used and discarded. Prudence pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of the general store, trying to control her ragged breathing. She traveled 2,000 miles to escape the controlling men of her past, only to find herself cornered by worse ones in the supposed freedom of the West. The sound of approaching boots made her blood run cold. She closed her eyes, preparing for the worst, when suddenly the boots stopped. "You ain't welcome in my town, Blackwell," came a low, dangerous voice she didn't recognize. "This ain't your concern, Callahan," replied a voice she recognized as Jonas Blackwell's second-in-command. "We're just looking for that stubborn lady doctor." "Well, you found me instead," the stranger said, "and I'm telling you to ride out. Now." The ensuing silence was punctuated only by the distant piano music from the saloon down the street. Then came the sound of retreating footsteps, muttered curses, and eventually horses galloping away. Prudence remained frozen, unsure if she should emerge from her hiding place. "They're gone, madam," the voice called out. "You can come out now." Cautiously, Prudence stepped from the shadows, finding herself face to face with a tall man whose features were partially obscured by the brim of his worn Stetson. He wore a faded blue shirt, dust-covered denim, and had a star-shaped badge pinned to his leather vest. Marshal Callahan, she presumed, though she hadn't formally met the town's new lawman who had arrived just last week. "Dr. Miller," he said with a slight nod. "I've been meaning to introduce myself. Marshal Matthew Callahan at your service." "I'd say your timing is impeccable, Marshal," Prudence replied, trying to steady her voice. "But I was handling the situation." A hint of amusement crossed his weather-worn face. "I can see that. Hiding in alleys is a time-honored tradition for handling armed outlaws." Prudence bristled. "I don't recall asking for your help or your sarcasm, Marshal." "You didn't have to ask," he said simply, scanning the street with watchful blue eyes. "Protecting folks is my job." "Well, I've learned not to rely on men to do their jobs when it comes to my safety," she replied, dusting off her skirts. "But I appreciate the intervention nonetheless." Matthew Callahan studied her for a moment, taking in her determined stance, the medical bag clutched tightly in her hand and the wariness in her eyes. "The Blackwell Gang doesn't give up easily," he warned. "They might be gone for now, but they'll be back. I should escort you home." "That won't be necessary," Prudence insisted, already moving toward the street. "My clinic is just around the corner, and I've managed on my own since arriving in this town." The marshal fell into step beside her anyway. "I'm sure you have, Dr. Miller, but humor me. I've been tracking the Blackwells for months, and they're not the kind of men a person should face alone, doctor or otherwise." As they walked down the main street, Prudence felt the eyes of townspeople watching them with interest. A female doctor was unusual enough. Being escorted by the handsome new marshal would certainly set tongues wagging by morning. "I presume Jonas Blackwell is the patient who stormed out of your clinic earlier today," Matthew said as they walked. "The one cursing loud enough for the whole town to hear." "Doctor-patient confidentiality prevents me from discussing my patients, Marshal," Prudence replied primly, though she couldn't help adding, "But yes, he took exception to my policy of payment before treatment for non-emergency cases." Matthew chuckled, a warm sound that seemed at odds with his otherwise serious demeanor. You refuse to treat Jonas Blackwell. Most folks around here would sooner cut off their own arm than cross that man. I don't discriminate in my medical practice, Marshal. Everyone pays the same fee, outlaw or upstanding citizen. My skills and medicines aren't free. They reached the small wooden building that served as both her clinic and her home. The words Dr. P. Miller, physician, were painted neatly on the front window. Prudence turned to face the marshal, extending her hand formally. "Thank you for your assistance, Marshal Callahan. I believe I can manage from here." Matthew took her hand briefly, his calloused palm rough against her skin. "I'll have a deputy keep an eye on your place tonight, just to be safe." "That's really not, it's no trouble," he interrupted. "And it's not up for debate, madam." Prudence bristled at his authoritative tone. "I don't recall electing you as the decision-maker for my life, Marshal." "No," he agreed, his expression softening slightly. "But I'd sleep better knowing you're safe. The Blackwells have killed for less than what happened today." Something in his voice, a note of genuine concern rather than condescension, made Prudence hesitate. Finally, she nodded once, tersely. "Fine. But I want it known that I'm perfectly capable of defending myself." She patted the small derringer she kept in her pocket. 4 years of medical school didn't leave much time for socializing, but I did learn to shoot." Matthew's mouth quirked up at one corner. "I don't doubt that for a moment, Doctor." "Miller," he tipped his hat to her. "Lock your doors, I'll see you tomorrow." As Prudence watched him walk away, his spurs jingling softly with each step, she couldn't decide if she was annoyed by his protective attitude or grateful for it. In her experience, men who started out seeming helpful usually wanted something in return. The question was, what did Marshal Matthew Callahan want from her? Inside her clinic, Prudence lit the lamps and moved through her evening routine, checking supplies and tidying up after the day's patients. As she worked, she kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the Blackwell Gang returning. But the street remained quiet except for the occasional passing horse and rider. True to his word, about an hour later, she spotted a young deputy taking up position across the street, settling in for what appeared to be a long night of guard duty. Prudence frowned. She hadn't asked for this protection, and the idea of being watched, even for her safety, made her uncomfortable. Still, as she prepared for bed in her small quarters behind the clinic, she had to admit there was a certain comfort in knowing someone was standing guard. Prudence had learned the hard way back east that trusting men led to disappointment or worse. Her father's gambling had destroyed their family fortune and reputation. Her fiancé had abandoned her when medical school proved more important to her than planning their wedding. And her medical professor had tried to take credit for her research on childhood diseases. No, Prudence Miller didn't trust men. But tonight, just for tonight, she decided she could trust in Marshal Callahan's sense of duty. Nothing more. What she didn't know was that Matthew Callahan sat awake in his office at the jailhouse, cleaning his Colt revolver and thinking about the stubborn doctor with the fierce eyes and the medical bag. He hadn't told her the whole truth that Jonas Blackwell had murdered a female doctor in Wyoming Territory 6 months earlier, when she couldn't save his brother from a gunshot wound. The woman's refusal to treat Jonas without payment today had likely signed her death warrant. Matthew had been pursuing the Blackwell Gang since that murder, following their trail of violence across 3 territories. Now they were here in his new jurisdiction and threatening a woman who reminded him too much of his late sister, independent, brave, and entirely too confident in her ability to handle danger alone. "Not this time," Matthew murmured to himself as he loaded his revolver. "Not on my watch." The following morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of pristine spring day that made the hardships of frontier life seem worthwhile. Prudence awoke early, as was her habit, and began preparing for the day's patients. Tuesday mornings usually brought the ranch hands who'd been injured during Monday's work and had stubbornly waited a day to seek treatment. She had just finished arranging her instruments when a sharp knock came at the door. It was earlier than she usually received patients, so she approached cautiously, her hand instinctively moving to the derringer in her pocket. "Who is it?" she called through the door. Marshal Callahan, Dr. Miller. Prudence smoothed her apron and opened the door to find the marshal standing there, looking even more imposing in the morning light than he had in the shadows of the previous evening. His dark hair was damp as though recently washed, and he'd shaved, revealing a strong jawline previously hidden beneath stubble. "Good morning, Marshal," she said formally. "I see your deputy survived the night without incident." "Deputy Johnson is made of sturdy stuff," Matthew replied with a slight smile. "May I come in? I have some information you need to hear." Prudence hesitated, then stepped aside. "I'm preparing to open for patients, so I can spare only a few minutes." Matthew entered, removing his hat as he did so. His eyes scanned the clinic with professional interest, taking in the neat arrangement of medicines on the shelves, the examination table in the center of the room, and the desk in the corner covered with medical journals. "Impressive setup," he commented. "Most doctors I've met out here work with far less. Most doctors haven't had to prove themselves twice as capable as their male counterparts to earn half the respect," Prudence replied, then immediately regretted her sharp tone. "What information brings you here so early, Marshal?" Matthew's expression grew serious. "The Blackwell Gang was spotted camped about 5 miles outside of town. My deputies and I rode out at dawn to investigate, but they were already gone." "And you believe they'll return?" Prudence asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I know they will," Matthew said grimly. "Dr. Miller, Prudence, there's something you should know about Jonas Blackwell. 6 months ago in Wyoming Territory, he murdered a female doctor named Sarah Winters when she couldn't save his brother from a gunshot wound. Before that, he killed a schoolteacher in Montana who rejected his advances." Prudence felt the blood drain from her face. "You're saying he specifically targets women who stand up to him?" "Yes, I've been tracking him since Dr. Winters' murder. That's why I took this position when it opened reports placed the gang in this area." "And you didn't think to mention this yesterday?" Prudence demanded, anger rising to mask her fear. "I didn't want to frighten you unnecessarily," Matthew admitted. "But after scouting their camp and finding these, I realized you need to know exactly what you're facing." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to her. Prudence unfolded it with trembling fingers to find a crude sketch of herself, along with the words, "The doc bring her alive." "They dropped this when they left camp," Matthew explained. "Jonas Blackwell doesn't just want to kill you, Dr. Miller, he wants to make an example of you." Prudence sank into her desk chair, the paper clutched in her hand. "I see. I'm arranging for additional deputies from the county seat, but they won't arrive for 2 days at least," Matthew continued. "Until then, I think you should stay at the hotel where I can post guards." Prudence looked up sharply. "I will do no such thing. This is my clinic, my home, and my livelihood. I have patients who depend on me." "Those patients would rather have you alive," Matthew argued. "Be reasonable, Prudence. This isn't about your independence or your capabilities. This is about a dangerous man with a vendetta. And what message would I send to this town if I hide away at the first sign of trouble?" she countered, rising to her feet. "I came west because women physicians are needed here, because I believe in the work I'm doing. Running away at the first threat undermines everything I've built." Matthew's jaw tightened, a muscle working beneath the tanned skin. "This isn't the first threat. This is a known killer who specifically targets women like you." "Women like me," Prudence echoed, her voice dangerously quiet. "Strong-willed, independent women who don't bend to men's demands," Matthew clarified. "I admire those qualities, Dr. Miller, but Jonas Blackwell sees them as a challenge to be broken." They stood facing each other, neither willing to back down. Finally, Prudence spoke. "I appreciate your concern, Marshal, truly, but I cannot and will not abandon my practice. However," she added as he opened his mouth to protest, "I will accept additional security measures if you deem them necessary." Matthew studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. "All right," he finally said, "but I want your word that you'll follow my instructions if the situation becomes more dangerous." "I don't make promises to men I barely know, Marshal Callahan," Prudence replied coolly. "I've found such promises often come with unexpected conditions." Something flickered in Matthew's blue eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition. "Fair enough," he said quietly. "Then just trust me for as long as it takes to keep you safe from Blackwell, nothing more." The simplicity of his request caught Prudence off guard. Trust him. She'd spent years building walls around herself, learning the hard way that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. And yet, there was something in Marshal Callahan's direct gaze that made her want to believe him. "I'll try," she finally said, the closest thing to a promise she could offer. Matthew nodded, seeming to understand the concession she'd made. "I'll have Deputy Johnson remain on duty outside during your business hours. I'll check in regularly, and Dr. Miller?" "Yes, keep that Derringer close." After the marshal left, Prudence found her hands shaking as she arranged her supplies. The sketch he'd shown her was burned into her memory, the crude likeness of her face, the ominous instruction to bring her alive. What had she gotten herself into simply by demanding payment for her services? Throughout the morning, patients trickled in Mrs. Henderson with her arthritic hands, young Billy Thompson with a splinter that had become infected, and 2 ranch hands from the Double C with minor injuries from breaking horses. Prudence tried to maintain her professional demeanor, but she found herself jumping at every sound from the street, her eyes constantly darting to the window. During a lull between patients, Prudence stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. Deputy Johnson nodded to her from his post across the street, his young face serious beneath his hat. The town seemed unusually quiet for a Tuesday. Perhaps word of the Blackwell Gang's presence had spread. "Afternoon, Dr. Miller," came a familiar voice, and Prudence turned to find Mrs. Abigail Porter, the owner of the town's small hotel and restaurant, approaching with a covered basket. "Thought you might appreciate some lunch, what with everything going on." "That's very kind, Mrs. Porter," Prudence said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Please come in." Inside, Abigail placed the basket on Prudence's desk and began unpacking sandwiches and a jar of lemonade. At 55, Abigail was one of the town's original settlers and something of a maternal figure to many of Redemption Creek's residents, including, apparently, its newest doctor. "The marshal stopped by the hotel this morning," Abigail said conversationally as she arranged the food. "Asked me to keep an eye out for strangers and to make sure you're eating properly." Prudence couldn't help but smile. "Marshal Callahan seems to be appointing himself guardian of my welfare." "He's a good man," Abigail said firmly. "Lost his sister to violence some years back, from what I hear. She was a teacher out in Arizona Territory. I suspect he sees something of her in you, educated, independent." This new information about Matthew gave Prudence pause. Perhaps his protective instincts came from a more personal place than she'd assumed. "I didn't know," she admitted. "Well, he's not one to talk about himself," Abigail replied, "but people talk and I listen." The marshal came highly recommended from his previous post. Supposedly tracked down a gang that had terrorized 3 territories. Man like that doesn't end up in a small town like ours by accident. "No," Prudence agreed thoughtfully. "I suppose he doesn't." After Abigail left, Prudence found herself pondering this new information about Matthew Callahan. A man pursuing justice for his sister's death was different from a man simply throwing his authority around. It didn't mean she trusted him, but perhaps she could understand him a little better. The afternoon brought more patients, including elderly Mr. Gunderson, who insisted on telling her all about the last time outlaws had come to Redemption Creek back in '68. "Whole town banded together, we did," he wheezed as she checked his lungs. "Men on the rooftops with rifles, women and children safe in the church. Ran those varmints right out of town, we did." "That's quite impressive, Mr. Gunderson," Prudence replied, trying to concentrate on the sounds in his chest rather than the anxiety building in her own. "Course, that was before your time," he continued. "But folks around here know how to stand together when trouble comes. You remember that, Doc." As the day waned and she closed up her clinic, Prudence found herself reflecting on Mr. Gunderson's words. The people of Redemption Creek had welcomed her, despite initial skepticism about a female doctor. They'd brought their ailments to her, trusted her with their health, invited her to their social gatherings. This was her community now. Just as she was locking the door, Marshal Callahan appeared, leading his horse. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street, giving the scene an ethereal quality. "Evening, Dr. Miller," he greeted her. "Thought I'd walk you to dinner at the hotel. Mrs. Porter is holding a table for us." "Us," Prudence echoed, raising an eyebrow. "It's easier to protect you if I'm nearby," Matthew explained matter-of-factly. "And Mrs. Porter makes the best chicken and dumplings this side of the Mississippi on Tuesdays." "I was planning to eat here," Prudence protested, gesturing to her living quarters behind the clinic. "Alone, behind windows that face the street with only a derringer for protection," Matthew pointed out. "Or you could enjoy a hot meal in a public place with armed law enforcement present. Your choice, doctor." Put that way, the decision seemed obvious, if annoying. "You're very persistent, Marshal Callahan." "Part of the job description," he replied with the hint of a smile. "Shall we?" Reluctantly, Prudence locked her clinic door and fell into step beside Matthew, acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk as they walked toward the hotel. The marshal's presence beside her was solid and reassuring, despite her determination not to need reassurance. "No sign of the Blackwells today," Matthew informed her as they walked, "but that doesn't mean they've given up. Jonas is a patient man when it comes to revenge." "A comforting thought," Prudence remarked dryly. "Not meant to comfort, just to prepare," Matthew replied. "I've sent telegrams to neighboring towns warning them to be on the lookout. We'll get additional deputies by Thursday." "And in the meantime?" Prudence asked. "In the meantime, we remain vigilant," he said, "and you don't go anywhere alone." Prudence bristled at this directive. "Marshal, I appreciate your concern, but I cannot have an escort following me every minute of the day." "I have patients to see, house calls to make, then I'll accompany you on house calls," Matthew interrupted. "And Deputy Johnson or Deputy Wilson will be stationed outside your clinic during business hours." "That's completely impractical," Prudence protested. "You have an entire town to protect, not just me." They had reached the hotel by this time, and Matthew held the door open for her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "With all due respect, Dr. Miller, I've been tracking Jonas Blackwell long enough to know his patterns. Right now, you're his primary target. Protecting you is protecting my town." Inside the hotel restaurant, Mrs. Porter waved them to a corner table already set for two. The room was busy with the dinner crowd, and Prudence felt the weight of curious stares as she and the marshal made their way through the tables. "People will talk," she murmured as they sat down. "People always talk," Matthew replied with a shrug. In a town this size, breathing gives them something to gossip about. Despite her reservations, Prudence found herself relaxing as the meal progressed. Matthew Callahan proved to be surprisingly good company, sharing stories of his time as a Texas Ranger before taking up his marshal's badge. He spoke of the changing West, the coming of the railroads, and his hopes for more civilized settlements. "Don't misunderstand," he said as they finished their chicken and dumplings, which were indeed excellent. "I believe in frontier justice when necessary. But I'd rather see towns with schools and churches and doctors than more saloons and gambling halls." "A progressive view for a lawman," Prudence observed. "My sister was a teacher," Matthew said quietly, confirming what Abigail had told her earlier. "She believed education was the future of the West, not guns." "I'm sorry about your sister," Prudence said gently. "Mrs. Porter mentioned you had lost her." Matthew's eyes darkened. "Elizabeth was teaching in a small mining town in Arizona Territory. A man took exception to her rejecting his proposal of marriage. He killed her and 3 of her students before turning the gun on himself." Prudence felt a chill run through her at the stark parallel to her own situation. "That's why you're so determined to protect me from Blackwell." "It's part of it," Matthew admitted, "but it's also my job and it's the right thing to do." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the front of the restaurant. Deputy Johnson burst through the door, his young face flushed with exertion. "Marshal," he called, spotting Matthew. "Riders spotted approaching from the north. Looks like the Blackwell Gang, sir." Matthew was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "How many?" At least 6, maybe more, Johnson reported. They're moving slow, like they're not trying to hide. A show of force, Matthew muttered. He turned to Prudence. Stay here with Mrs. Porter. Johnson, get Wilson and meet me at the office. We need to organize the townsmen. I should go to my clinic, Prudence said, standing. I may be needed if there's violence. No, Matthew said firmly. Your clinic is too exposed, and it's the first place they'll look for you. Stay here until I come for you. Marshal Callahan, Prudence began, her voice tight with frustration. Please, he said, his blue eyes holding hers. Trust me on this, just until we know what we're dealing with. There it was again, that request for trust. Prudence wanted to argue, to assert her independence as she always did, but the urgency in Matthew's voice and the memory of his sister's fate gave her pause. 1 hour, she conceded. If you haven't returned in 1 hour, I'm going to my clinic to prepare for potential casualties. Matthew nodded once sharply, and then he was gone, Deputy Johnson at his heels. The restaurant erupted in nervous chatter as soon as the door closed behind them. Come on, dear Mrs. Porter said, appearing at Prudence's elbow. Let's get you upstairs away from these windows. Prudence allowed herself to be led to a small sitting room on the second floor where Mrs. Porter served her tea and tried to maintain a stream of cheerful conversation. But Prudence's mind was on the approaching riders and the man who had gone to meet them, a man who had lost his sister to violence and seemed determined not to lose anyone else on his watch. For the first time since arriving in Redemption Creek, Prudence Miller felt fear taking root in her heart. Not just fear for herself, but fear for the town that had become her home, and for the marshal whose protective instincts she had so stubbornly resisted. The hour she had allotted Matthew Callahan ticked by with excruciating slowness. From the upstairs window, Prudence could see townspeople hurrying through the streets, some carrying rifles, others ushering women and children toward the church at the end of the main street. It reminded her of Mr. Gunderson's story of the last time outlaws had threatened Redemption Creek. Just as Prudence was preparing to leave for her clinic, disregarding Matthew's instructions, she heard heavy boots on the hotel stairs. A moment later, the door opened to reveal the marshal, his expression grim but composed. They've made camp just outside town, he reported without preamble. 6 men, all armed. Jonas Blackwell sent a message. He wants to speak with you at noon tomorrow or they'll burn the town. Speak with me, Prudence echoed, her mouth suddenly dry. About what? He didn't specify, Matthew said, but I don't intend to let that meeting happen. We're organizing the town's defense tonight. Every able-bodied man with a rifle will be positioned strategically by dawn. And me? Prudence asked. What would you have me do, Marshal? Matthew's expression softened slightly. I'd have you safe, Dr. Miller, but I suspect that's not in your nature. No, she agreed, it's not. Then I need you to prepare your clinic for possible casualties, he said. And I need you to stay within sight of armed deputies at all times. Can you do that? It wasn't a demand, Prudence realized. It was a request from a man who had seen the worst of what someone like Jonas Blackwell could do. I can, she agreed, but I want something in return. Name it. The truth, Prudence said. All of it. What does Jonas Blackwell really want with me? Is it truly about payment for treatment, or is there more? Matthew hesitated, then gestured for her to sit. He took the chair opposite her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. In the lamplight, his face looked older, the lines around his eyes more pronounced. Jonas Blackwell fancies himself a collector, Matthew began, his voice low. Not of objects, but of people, specifically women who challenge him. His gang has left a trail of missing women across 3 territories. Some were found dead, others were never found at all. Prudence felt her blood run cold. And you believe I'm his next collection? You stood up to him, Matthew said simply. In his mind, that makes you his to break. The fact that you're educated, respected, that just makes the challenge more appealing to him. Why didn't you tell me this before? Prudence demanded, though she already knew the answer. Would you have believed me? Matthew asked. Or would you have dismissed it as a man trying to frighten you into compliance? The truth of his words stung. She likely would have rejected such warnings as exaggeration or manipulation. It was safer that way, safer than admitting that real danger existed, that perhaps she did need protection. "So what happens now?" Prudence asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Now we prepare," Matthew said. "The town is with us. Redemption Creek protects its own. By morning we'll have men positioned on every rooftop and behind every water trough. If Blackwell and his men ride in looking for trouble, they'll find more than they bargained for. And if innocent people are hurt in the crossfire," Prudence pressed. "What then, Marshal?" Matthew's jaw tightened. "That's why we're preparing now, to minimize that risk. Perhaps there's another way," Prudence suggested slowly, "a way that doesn't involve gunfire in the streets." "I'm listening," Matthew said, though his expression was skeptical. "I'm the one Blackwell wants," Prudence said. "What if I offered to meet with him under controlled conditions, at the church, perhaps with armed men hidden nearby?" "Absolutely not," Matthew said flatly. "I won't use you as bait." "It wouldn't be as bait," Prudence argued. "It would be a controlled meeting to determine what he really wants and possibly negotiate a peaceful resolution." "Prudence," Matthew said, using her given name with an intensity that caught her off guard. "Jonas Blackwell doesn't negotiate. He manipulates, he threatens, and then he takes what he wants. I won't risk your life on the slim chance he's suddenly developed diplomatic tendencies." The use of her first name without her title created an unexpected intimacy between them. For a moment, Prudence saw not the authoritative marshal but a man deeply concerned for her safety. "Then what would you have me do?" she asked quietly. "Stay here tonight," Matthew said. "Mrs. Porter has prepared a room for you. In the morning, I'll escort you to your clinic to gather whatever supplies you might need, then bring you to the church where the women and children will be gathered. It's the most defensible building in town." Prudence wanted to argue, to insist on her independence and her ability to defend herself. But the weight of what Matthew had told her about Blackwell, about his sister, about the danger facing not just her but the entire town settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. "All right," she agreed finally, "but I want your word that you'll send for me if there are injuries requiring treatment regardless of the situation." "You have it," Matthew promised. "I know better than to stand between a doctor and her patients." A ghost of a smile touched Prudence's lips. "Perhaps you're learning, Marshal Callahan." As night fell over Redemption Creek, Prudence found herself in a small but comfortable room on the second floor of the hotel. Mrs. Porter had provided a nightgown and basic toiletries, along with assurances that the hotel was well guarded. Still, sleep eluded Prudence as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the occasional footsteps of deputies patrolling outside and thinking of what morning might bring. Her thoughts kept returning to Matthew Callahan, to the pain she'd glimpsed in his eyes when he spoke of his sister, to the determined set of his jaw when he vowed to protect the town, to the way he'd asked for her trust. In Boston, men had sought to control her, to diminish her accomplishments, to mold her into someone more suitable for their needs. Matthew seemed to want none of those things. He simply wanted her safe. It was a novel experience, being valued for exactly who she was, even if that person was stubborn and independent to a fault. Eventually, exhaustion overcame anxiety, and Prudence drifted into an uneasy sleep. She dreamed of gunfire in the streets, of blood on her hands that she couldn't wash away, of Matthew Callahan falling before her eyes while Jonas Blackwell laughed in the background. She awoke with a start just before dawn, her heart pounding. Outside her window, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten, promising another beautiful spring day that seemed at odds with the tension gripping the town. Prudence dressed quickly in the same clothes she'd worn the previous day, grateful that at least Mrs. Porter had provided a clean apron. She had just finished pinning up her hair when a knock came at her door. "Dr. Miller, it's Marshal Callahan." Prudence opened the door to find Matthew looking as though he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were alert but shadowed, and he'd clearly been awake through the night. "Good morning, Marshal," she greeted him. "You look like you could use a cup of coffee." "Already had 3, he replied with a tired smile. "Mrs. Porter keeps a pot brewing for us night owls. Are you ready? I'd like to get you to your clinic and back before Blackwell's men start stirring." The streets were quiet as they walked quickly to Prudence's clinic, though Prudence noted armed men positioned on several rooftops, nodding respectfully as she and Matthew passed. The town had indeed rallied to its defense. At the clinic, Prudence moved efficiently, packing bandages, antiseptics, suture materials, and pain medications into her large medical bag. She added a second bag with splints, more bandages, and her surgical instruments, preparing for the worst. Matthew asked, watching her from the doorway where he maintained a vigilant stance. "Always," Prudence replied. "It's what doctors do." She hesitated, then moved to a cabinet in the corner, unlocking it with a small key she kept on a chain around her neck. From inside, she withdrew a worn leather case. "My father's service revolver," she explained as Matthew raised an eyebrow. "He was a surgeon in the war, taught me to shoot when I was 12, said a lady should know how to defend herself." "Sound advice," Matthew commented. "You're full of surprises, Dr. Miller." "I find it useful to keep men guessing," Prudence replied with the hint of a smile. "It prevents them from becoming too comfortable with their assumptions." Matthew chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to ease some of the tension between them. "I don't think I've been comfortable with any assumptions about you since the moment we met." As they gathered her supplies, Prudence felt a strange reluctance to leave her clinic, as if abandoning it somehow meant surrendering to Blackwell's threats. But she knew the logic of Matthew's plan. The church was indeed more defensible, and her skills would be needed there if the worst happened. "Ready?" Matthew asked, taking the heavier of her two bags. Prudence cast one last look around her clinic at the examining table where she'd delivered babies and set broken bones, at the desk where she'd written letters to medical journals, at the shelf of books that represented years of study and dedication. This place was more than just her livelihood, it was the physical manifestation of everything she'd worked for. "Yes," she said firmly, picking up her remaining bag and her father's revolver case. "Let's go." They had just stepped onto the boardwalk when the sound of approaching horses reached them. Matthew's hand immediately went to his gun as he positioned himself slightly in front of Prudence. "Get back inside," he ordered, his voice tense, but it was too late. 6 riders appeared at the end of the street, moving at a leisurely pace toward them. At their head rode a man Prudence recognized immediately: Jonas Blackwell, his dark beard and cold eyes unmistakable even at a distance. "Well, well," Blackwell called out as the riders drew closer. "If it ain't the good doctor and her pet lawman, saving me the trouble of hunting you down." Matthew's posture remained relaxed, but Prudence could sense the coiled tension in him. "That's far enough, Blackwell," he called back. "You're not welcome in this town." Blackwell reined his horse to a stop about 20 yards away, his men following suit. "Now that ain't very hospitable, Marshal, especially when I've come to make a business proposition to the lady doctor here." "Any business you have can be conducted through me," Matthew replied evenly. "I don't think so," Blackwell said, his eyes shifting to Prudence. "See, the doc and I have unfinished business. She refused to treat my wound yesterday unless I paid first, made me look weak in front of my men. That kind of disrespect can't go unanswered." "I treat all my patients equally, mister." "Blackwell," Prudence said, stepping forward despite Matthew's attempt to keep her behind him. "Payment is required for non-emergency services. It was nothing personal." Blackwell's laugh was cold. "Everything's personal in my world, Doc, but I'm willing to be reasonable. You come with us peacefully, tend to my men when they need it, and we'll leave this town standing. Refuse, and well," he gestured broadly at the buildings around them. "Wood burns real nice this time of year." "She's not going anywhere with you," Matthew said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And neither are you burning this town. You're outnumbered, Blackwell. Look around." As if on cue, the armed townsmen who had been hidden on rooftops and in doorways revealed themselves: at least 20 men with rifles trained on Blackwell and his gang. Blackwell seemed unperturbed by this show of force. "Impressive, Marshal, but are you willing to risk a shootout in the middle of your street? How many of these fine citizens will die before my men go down? And make no mistake, we won't go down easy." The tension in the air was palpable. Prudence knew that Blackwell was right. A gunfight now would mean casualties on both sides, possibly including innocent bystanders. She looked at Matthew, saw the calculation in his eyes as he weighed the options. Before either man could speak again, Prudence stepped forward, her decision made. "I have a counter-proposal, Mr. Blackwell," she said clearly. "I will examine your wound and provide treatment here and now in the street where everyone can see, no payment required, as a gesture of goodwill. In return, you and your men will ride out of Redemption Creek and not return." "Prudence, no," Matthew said under his breath. "It's a professional courtesy," she replied without looking at him. "Nothing more." Blackwell considered her offer, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "And if I want more than just treatment for my wound?" "Then these men will open fire," Prudence said steadily. "And as the marshal pointed out, you're outnumbered. Some of you might escape, but you won't, Mr. Blackwell, I guarantee it." A tense silence followed her words. Prudence was acutely aware of Matthew beside her, of the armed men watching from their positions, of her own heartbeat loud in her ears. She had gambled everything on the hope that Blackwell valued his life more than his pride. Finally, Blackwell laughed, a genuine sound of amusement this time. "You got spirit, Doc, I'll give you that. All right, I accept your terms. Treatment in the street, then we ride out." "Dismount and approach alone," Matthew instructed, his hand still on his gun. "Your men stay where they are." Blackwell swung down from his horse with a grimace that suggested his wound was indeed causing him discomfort. He walked toward them slowly, hands visible at his sides. "Set up here," Matthew said to Prudence, indicating a spot on the boardwalk where he could keep Blackwell in front of him and maintain a clear view of the outlaw's men. Prudence quickly arranged her supplies on a small table Mrs. Porter brought out from the hotel. As Blackwell approached, she donned her most professional demeanor. "Remove your jacket and shirt, please," she instructed. "I need to examine the wound properly." Blackwell complied, revealing a poorly bandaged wound on his left shoulder. The bullet had grazed him, tearing a furrow through the muscle but not lodging in the tissue. "Whoever wrapped this did a poor job," Prudence commented as she carefully removed the dirty bandage. "The wound is showing signs of infection." "Not all of us travel with fine lady doctors," Blackwell replied, watching her closely as she cleaned the wound with antiseptic solution. He hissed at the sting but didn't pull away. "You're fortunate," Prudence told him as she worked. "The bullet didn't lodge in the tissue. With proper care, this should heal without complication." "Lucky me," Blackwell said dryly. As Prudence applied a fresh bandage, she was acutely aware of Matthew standing close by, his eyes never leaving Blackwell. The outlaw leader seemed equally aware of the marshal's scrutiny. "You and I have unfinished business too, Callahan," Blackwell said conversationally. "Wyoming territory ring any bells?" "Every day," Matthew replied evenly. "Dr. Sarah Winters, she was trying to help your brother when you shot her." "She let him die," Blackwell countered, his voice hardening. "Just like your sister let those children die in Arizona." Matthew's entire body tensed, and for a moment Prudence feared he might draw his gun, but he controlled himself with visible effort. "My sister died trying to protect those children from a madman," Matthew said quietly. "Just like Dr. Winters died trying to save your brother from the consequences of your criminal lifestyle." Blackwell's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Watch yourself, Marshal. Our agreement is with the doc here, not with you." "There," Prudence said, finishing the bandage and stepping back. "Keep it clean and dry. Change the bandage daily. The infection should clear up with proper care." Blackwell rolled his shoulder experimentally, then began pulling on his shirt. "Obliged, Doc. You do fine work." "I've fulfilled my part of our agreement," Prudence said firmly. "Now it's your turn, Mr. Blackwell. You and your men ride out and don't return." Blackwell buttoned his shirt slowly, his eyes moving between Prudence and Matthew. "A deal's a deal," he finally said. "But remember this, Doc, not many people get to walk away from Jonah's Blackwell. Consider yourself special." The threat underlying his words was unmistakable. Prudence maintained her professional composure, but inside she felt a chill. "Good day, Mr. Blackwell," she said evenly. "Safe travels." Blackwell nodded once, then turned and walked back to his horse. As he mounted, he called to his men, "We're done here, boys. Time to ride." The town watched in tense silence as the Blackwell gang turned their horses and began riding slowly back the way they had come. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Prudence realize she'd been holding her breath. Around them, the armed townsmen began to relax, lowering their rifles and exchanging relieved glances. Mrs. Porter emerged from the hotel with coffee for the men who had stood watch through the night. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever witnessed," Matthew said quietly to Prudence. "Possibly both. It worked, didn't it?" Prudence replied, beginning to pack up her medical supplies with hands that shook slightly now that the danger had passed. "No bloodshed, no burning buildings. For now," Matthew cautioned. "Jonas Blackwell isn't a man who forgives or forgets. He'll be back." "Then we'll be ready," Prudence said with more confidence than she felt. "The town stood together today. We'll do it again if necessary." Matthew studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in his blue eyes. "You're a remarkable woman, Dr. Miller." "I'm a practical woman, Marshal Callahan," she corrected him. "Violence should always be the last resort, not the first. A philosophy I share," Matthew said. "Though in my line of work, the last resort tends to arrive sooner rather than later." As the tension of the morning began to dissipate, townspeople emerged from their homes and businesses, gathering in small groups to discuss the confrontation. Several approached Prudence to express their admiration for her courage. "Never seen anything like it," old Mr. Gunderson declared, pumping her hand enthusiastically. "Standing up to Jonas Blackwell himself. Wait till I tell my grandson about this." Prudence accepted their praise graciously, though in truth she felt more exhausted than heroic. The fear and anxiety she had suppressed during the confrontation were beginning to catch up with her. "You should rest," Matthew said, noticing her pallor. "It's been a trying morning." "I have patients to see," Prudence protested, though without her usual vigor. "They can wait a few hours," Matthew insisted gently. "Doctor's orders, or in this case, Marshal's orders. Come, I'll walk you back to your clinic." Too tired to argue, Prudence allowed Matthew to escort her back to her clinic, where he insisted on checking every room before declaring it safe. As he turned to leave, Prudence found herself reluctant to see him go. "Marshal," she called after him. "Thank you for everything." Matthew turned, his expression softening. "Just doing my job, Dr. Miller." "No," Prudence said quietly. "It was more than that. You were willing to risk your life to protect me, a woman you barely know." "Perhaps I'd like the chance to know you better," Matthew replied, his voice equally quiet. "When this is all over." The simple honesty of his statement caught Prudence off guard. No clever remarks, no grand declarations, just a straightforward expression of interest that left her momentarily speechless. "I would like that too," she finally admitted, surprising herself with the truth of it. A smile touched Matthew's lips, warming his eyes. "Then we have something to look forward to. Rest now, Prudence. I'll check on you later." After he left, Prudence sank into the chair behind her desk, emotionally and physically drained. The encounter with Blackwell had been terrifying, but she had stood her ground. And more surprisingly, she had admitted, both to Matthew and to herself, that perhaps there was room in her life for something more than just her medical practice. It was a startling realization for a woman who had spent years building walls around her heart. But then again, Prudence Miller had always prided herself on facing difficult truths head-on, and the truth was, Marshal Matthew Callahan had begun to matter to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. As Prudence closed her eyes, allowing herself a brief rest before resuming her duties, she wondered what her future in Redemption Creek might hold, and whether that future might include a certain blue-eyed marshal who had asked for nothing more than her trust. The following days passed with a tentative return to normalcy in Redemption Creek. The Blackwell Gang had seemingly kept their word, riding away without further incident. Still, Matthew maintained extra patrols and kept a deputy near Prudence's clinic during business hours, just as a precaution. He insisted when she questioned the necessity. Prudence found herself gradually adjusting to this watchful presence in her life. What had initially felt like an imposition now provided a strange comfort. More surprising was how often Matthew himself stopped by, sometimes with legitimate town business to discuss, other times with transparent excuses that made her hide a smile. A week after the confrontation with Blackwell, Matthew arrived at her clinic just as she was closing for the day. "Good evening, Dr. Miller," he greeted her, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Busy day," the usual assortment of complaints, Prudence replied, washing her hands at the basin. "Mrs. Thompson's arthritis, 2 cases of spring fever, and young Tommy Watson with a fishing hook caught in his thumb, nothing life-threatening." "A good day, then," Matthew observed, leaning against the doorframe with an ease that suggested he was becoming comfortable in her space. "Indeed." Prudence dried her hands and turned to face him fully. "And what brings the town marshal to my clinic at closing time? More precautionary measures." Matthew's smile was sheepish. "Actually, I came with an invitation. The town council is holding a celebration this Saturday to thank everyone for standing together against the Blackwell threat. There'll be music, dancing, food. And you're here in an official capacity to inform me of this event?" Prudence asked, unable to resist teasing him a little. "No," Matthew admitted, meeting her eyes directly. "I'm here to ask if you'd attend with me, as my guest." The forthright request took Prudence by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Matthew Callahan had proven himself to be a direct man in all things. "Marshal Callahan, are you asking to court me?" Prudence asked, her tone light but her heart suddenly racing. "I believe I am, Dr. Miller," he replied with equal lightness, though his eyes remained serious. "If you're amenable." Prudence considered him thoughtfully. In Boston, courtship had been a formal affair of calling cards and chaperone visits, of calculated social advantages and family connections. Matthew's straightforward approach was refreshingly honest by comparison. "I haven't been courted since I left Boston," she said carefully. "And even then, I found the process rather tedious." "I can promise it won't be tedious," Matthew said with a smile that made her pulse quicken. "Though I can't promise it won't be unconventional. A marshal's schedule isn't exactly conducive to traditional courtship." "Nor is a doctor's," Prudence pointed out. "We might go days without seeing each other if emergencies arise." "Then we'll make the most of the time we do have," Matthew suggested. "Starting with Saturday's celebration, what do you say, Prudence? Will you give this unconventional courtship a chance?" Put that way, how could she refuse? This man had stood beside her against danger, had respected her skills and independence even while seeking to protect her, had never once suggested she was anything less than his equal. "Yes," she said simply. "I believe I will." The pleasure that lit Matthew's face at her acceptance was worth any risk she might be taking with her carefully guarded heart. "Saturday at 6, then," he said. "I'll call for you here." After he left, Prudence found herself smiling as she completed her closing tasks. The idea of attending a town celebration on Matthew's arm both thrilled and terrified her. It would signal to everyone in Redemption Creek that there was something between them, something beyond the professional relationship of town marshal and town doctor. Was she ready for that step? For years, Prudence had defined herself solely through her medical practice, keeping relationships at arm's length to protect herself from disappointment. But Matthew was different from the men she'd known before. He saw her strength as an asset, not a threat. He protected without controlling, supported without diminishing. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was worth the risk of trust. Saturday arrived with perfect spring weather, clear blue skies and mild temperatures that seemed designed for an outdoor celebration. Prudence spent more time than usual on her appearance, selecting a blue dress she rarely wore due to its impracticality for medical work. She even unpacked the tortoiseshell combs her mother had given her before she left for medical school, using them to pin up her dark hair in a more elaborate style than her usual practical bun. The effect, when she surveyed herself in the small mirror, was pleasing. She looked like herself, but a version of herself that existed outside the confines of her professional identity, a woman who might dance under the stars with a handsome marshal. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock came at her door. Prudence took a deep breath, smoothed her skirts one last time, and went to answer it. Matthew stood on her porch, looking almost boyish in his nervousness. He had traded his usual work clothes for a clean dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd clearly taken extra care with his shaving. In his hands he held a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Prudence," he said softly, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious appreciation. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," she replied, suddenly feeling shy in a way she hadn't since her debut in Boston society years ago. "You look quite handsome yourself, Marshal." "Matthew," he corrected gently. "I think we're well past formalities, don't you?" "Matthew," Prudence agreed, liking the way his name felt on her lips. "Shall we go? I can hear the music already." He offered her the wildflowers with a slightly self-conscious smile. "I picked these this morning, nothing fancy, but they reminded me of you thriving where others might not expect it." Touched by the simple gesture and the thought behind it, Prudence accepted the flowers. "They're lovely. Let me put them in water before we go." As they walked toward the town square where the celebration was being held, Prudence was acutely aware of Matthew beside her, of his solid presence, of the occasional brush of his arm against hers, of the interested glances from townspeople they passed. For once, she found she didn't mind the attention. The town square had been transformed for the occasion. Lanterns hung from trees, casting a warm glow over long tables laden with food. A platform had been erected at one end where local musicians played lively tunes. Couples were already dancing in the cleared space before them, while children ran playing between the tables and older folks sat in chairs along the periphery, watching the proceedings with contented smiles. "Quite a turnout," Matthew observed as they approached. "Seems like the whole town is here." "Redemption Creek knows how to celebrate," Prudence agreed. "When I first arrived, there was a harvest festival that lasted 3 days. I treated more sprained ankles from enthusiastic dancing than I had in my entire previous practice." Mrs. Porter spotted them as they reached the edge of the square and hurried over, her round face beaming with approval. "Dr. Miller, Marshal Callahan, don't you two make a handsome couple?" She looked meaningfully at Matthew. "I told you that blue dress would match her eyes perfectly." Prudence raised an eyebrow at Matthew, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I might have asked Mrs. Porter for some advice," he admitted, being somewhat out of practice with social occasions. He wanted everything to be perfect, Mrs. Porter confided to Prudence with a wink. "Now come, both of you. The buffet is open, and Samuel Henderson's roast beef waits for no one." The evening unfolded like a dream. Prudence and Matthew shared a meal at one of the long tables, surrounded by townspeople who stopped by to chat, to thank the marshal for organizing the town's defense, to express their admiration for the doctor's bravery in facing down Jonah's Blackwell. "You're quite the local heroes," Prudence observed after Mr. Gunderson had regaled those nearby with yet another retelling of the confrontation, each version more dramatic than the last. "I'm just glad it ended peacefully," Matthew replied, "though I still think you took an unnecessary risk." "Says the man who faces armed outlaws as part of his daily routine," Prudence countered with a smile. "That's different," Matthew insisted. "It's my job to take those risks. And it's my job to heal people," Prudence said, "even difficult people like Jonah's Blackwell." Matthew shook his head, but his eyes were warm as they met hers. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Dr. Prudence Miller." "I'll take that as a compliment, Marshal Matthew Callahan," she replied, holding his gaze. The musicians struck up a waltz and couples began moving to the dance area. Matthew stood and extended his hand to Prudence. "Would you do me the honor?" he asked formally, though his eyes twinkled with barely suppressed delight. Prudence placed her hand in his. "I should warn you, it's been some time since I waltzed. Fortunately, it's like riding a horse," Matthew said as he led her to the dance floor. "Your body remembers even when your mind forgets." As it turned out, Matthew was an excellent dancer, guiding Prudence with a confidence that belied his earlier nervousness. His hand at her waist was respectful but firm, his steps sure as he led her through the turns of the waltz. Where did a frontier lawman learn to dance so well? Prudence asked, impressed despite herself. "My mother insisted all her children learn proper social graces," Matthew explained. "Said just because we lived on the frontier didn't mean we had to act like we were raised by wolves." She sounds like a formidable woman, Prudence observed. She was, Matthew agreed, a touch of sadness coloring his voice. She passed 2 winters ago, influenza. I'm sorry, Prudence said softly. Were you able to be with her? Matthew nodded. I got there in time to say goodbye. She made me promise to find a good woman and settle down. Said she wanted grandchildren to spoil before she met her maker in the hereafter. There was a hint of a question in his words, an opening for Prudence to indicate whether such a future might ever include her. It was too soon for such considerations, and yet, dancing in Matthew's arms under the starlit sky, Prudence found herself wondering what it might be like to build a life with this man. "And have you found that good woman?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew's eyes held hers, serious and sincere. "I believe I might have," he said, "but she's a cautious woman who doesn't trust easily, so I'm willing to wait for as long as it takes." The echo of his words from their first meaningful conversation wasn't lost on Prudence. "Then just trust me," he had said. And against all her better judgment, she was beginning to do just that. The waltz ended, but Matthew kept hold of her hand, leading her away from the dance floor toward the edge of the square where the night air was cooler and the press of the crowd less intense. "I've enjoyed this evening more than any in recent memory," he told her as they walked slowly along the perimeter of the celebration. "Your company is enlightening," Prudence repeated with amusement. "That's an unusual compliment." "You make me see things differently," Matthew explained. "You face danger not with a gun but with compassion. You stand your ground not with threats but with principles. It's refreshing." "And you," Prudence replied thoughtfully, "have shown me that perhaps not all protection comes with strings attached. That a man can respect a woman's independence while still caring for her safety." They had reached a quiet corner of the square, partially sheltered by the spreading branches of an old oak tree. The sounds of the celebration seemed distant here, the lantern light softer. "Prudence," Matthew said, turning to face her, "may I kiss you?" The directness of his question made her smile. Always honest, always straightforward, it was what she had come to expect from him. "Yes," she said simply, "you may." Matthew stepped closer, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. His touch was warm against her skin as he leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both tender and reverent. Prudence found herself responding with unexpected eagerness, her hands moving to rest on his chest, feeling the solid beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they finally parted, Matthew's eyes were dark with emotion. "I've wanted to do that since the moment you stood up to Jonah's Blackwell," he admitted with a slight smile. "That long," Prudence teased, her own heart racing at the intimacy they had just shared. "And here I thought it was since I agreed to attend this celebration with you." Matthew laughed softly, his hand still cradling her face. "I'm a patient man, Dr. Miller. When something's worth waiting for, I can be very patient indeed." They might have remained in that moment longer had a commotion from the direction of the celebration not interrupted them. Shouts and the sound of running feet drew their attention. Marshal Callahan. It was Deputy Johnson, his young face flushed with exertion as he spotted them and ran over. "Urgent telegram from Sheriff Taylor in Pine Ridge. The Blackwell Gang hit the bank there this afternoon. 2 dead, including the sheriff's deputy." The news landed like a physical blow. Pine Ridge was less than 20 miles from Redemption Creek, close enough that the Blackwell Gang could easily return. "Any indication of their direction after the robbery?" Matthew asked, immediately shifting back into his role as marshal. "Heading south, according to witnesses," Johnson reported. "Away from us, at least for now." "Gather the deputies at the office," Matthew instructed. "We need to coordinate with neighboring towns and double the patrols tonight just in case they circle back." As Johnson hurried off, Matthew turned back to Prudence, regret clear in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. "Duty calls." "I understand," Prudence assured him. "Go, do what you need to do." Matthew hesitated, then leaned down to press another quick kiss to her lips. "I'll see you tomorrow," he promised. "Lock your doors tonight." As she watched him stride purposefully back toward the celebration, Prudence felt a complex mix of emotions. Concern for the people of Pine Ridge, fear that the Blackwells might return to Redemption Creek, and a deep, unexpected longing for more moments like the one they had just shared under the oak tree. The evening that had begun with such promise now ended with uncertainty. Yet as Prudence made her way home, declining offers of escort with assurances that she could manage the short walk, she found herself oddly calm. Whatever dangers tomorrow might bring, she would face them preferably alongside the man who had begun to earn her trust, one day at a time. The news from Pine Ridge cast a shadow over Redemption Creek in the days that followed. Matthew was often absent, coordinating with neighboring towns to track the Blackwell Gang's movements. When he did appear, it was usually to provide Prudence with updates and to check on her safety brief visits that left little time for the more personal conversations they had begun to share. 2 weeks after the celebration, Prudence was returning from a house call at the Thompson farm when she spotted Matthew's horse tied outside her clinic. Her heart quickened at the sight, even as she reminded herself that his visit was likely official business. She found him waiting on her porch, his expression serious but softening as he saw her approach. "Prudence," he greeted her, stepping forward to take her medical bag. "I was beginning to worry." "The Thompson baby decided to make an early appearance," she explained as she unlocked her door. "A healthy boy, thankfully, despite being a few weeks premature." Inside, Prudence moved to wash her hands, acutely aware of Matthew's presence behind her. When she turned, drying her hands on a clean towel, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Is there news?" she asked, assuming his visit was related to the Blackwell situation. "Yes," Matthew said, removing his hat and turning it in his hands, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "The territorial governor has requested my assistance tracking the Blackwell Gang. They've hit 2 more banks since Pine Ridge, moving south toward the border. The governor wants someone who knows their patterns, someone who's faced them before." Prudence felt her heart sink. "You're leaving Redemption Creek." "Temporarily," Matthew clarified quickly. "A few weeks at most. Deputy Wilson will serve as acting marshal in my absence." "I see," Prudence said, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the disappointment washing over her. "When do you depart?" "Tomorrow morning," Matthew replied, watching her closely. "I came to tell you in person. I didn't want you to hear it from town gossip." "I appreciate that," Prudence said, moving to her desk to give herself something to do, somewhere to look besides his concerned face. "It's an important assignment. The governor clearly values your expertise." "Prudence," Matthew said softly, closing the distance between them. "Look at me, please." She turned reluctantly, meeting his gaze. The emotion she saw there made her breath catch. "I don't want to go," he admitted, "but I can't refuse this assignment, not when lives are at stake. Including, potentially, yours. As long as the Blackwells are free, you're in danger." "I understand," Prudence assured him, and she did. How could she fault him for doing his duty, for protecting others? It was what had drawn her to him in the first place, his unwavering commitment to justice and safety. "I'll come back," Matthew promised, taking her hands in his. "As soon as it's done, and when I do—" He hesitated, seeming to search for the right words. "When I do, I hope we can continue what we've started here." Prudence found herself nodding, her throat tight with emotion she couldn't express. "I'd like that," she managed to say. Matthew's relief was palpable. He lifted one hand to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as he leaned down to kiss her. Unlike their first kiss under the oak tree, this one held a hint of desperation, of things unsaid, of time running too short. When they parted, Matthew rested his forehead against hers for a moment, his eyes closed. "I need to finish preparations at the office," he said reluctantly. "But I'll stop by before I leave in the morning." "Be careful," Prudence urged, her hand resting over his heart. "The Blackwells are dangerous men." "So am I," Matthew reminded her with a slight smile, "when I need to be." After he left, Prudence found herself restless, unable to focus on her usual evening tasks. The thought of Matthew pursuing the Blackwell Gang filled her with dread. She had seen firsthand the ruthlessness of Jonas Blackwell, had heard of the deaths he had caused. Now Matthew would be deliberately placing himself in that man's path. For the first time in years, Prudence found herself offering a silent prayer not for herself, but for the safety of a man who had somehow breached the carefully constructed walls around her heart. Morning came with a gray drizzle that matched Prudence's mood. She had slept poorly, her dreams filled with gunfire and danger. She rose early, dressing with particular care despite telling herself it didn't matter, that Matthew was leaving regardless of how she looked to bid him farewell. He arrived as promised, just after dawn, mounted on his bay gelding and leading a pack-horse loaded with supplies. His duster and hat were already dampened by the light rain, but his expression brightened when he saw her waiting on her porch. "I wasn't sure you'd be awake," he said, dismounting and tying his horses to her hitching post. "I wanted to see you off," Prudence replied, trying to sound more cheerful than she felt, "and to give you this." She held out a small leather pouch. "Medical supplies, antiseptic, bandages, laudanum for pain, just in case." Matthew accepted the pouch, his fingers brushing hers. "Thank you, though I plan to return without needing any of it." "See that you do," Prudence said, her attempt at sternness undermined by the tremor in her voice. Matthew stepped closer, rain dripping from the brim of his hat as he looked down at her. "I'll send word when I can," he promised, "though it may be infrequent depending on where the trail leads." "I understand," Prudence assured him. "Just come back safely, that's all I ask." "I will," Matthew said, his voice low and fervent. "I have a powerful reason to return, after all." He kissed her then, heedless of who might see them standing on her porch in the early morning rain. Prudence clung to him, memorizing the feel of his arms around her, the scent of leather and soap that she had come to associate with him, the steady strength of his embrace. All too soon he was pulling away, mounting his horse with practiced ease. "Take care of yourself, Prudence," he said, gathering the reins, "and trust Deputy Wilson to look after the town. He's young, but he's capable." "I will," she promised. "Godspeed, Matthew." She stood on her porch long after he had disappeared from sight, the rain mingling with tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. It was foolish, she told herself, to feel this sense of loss over a temporary absence. Matthew would return in a few weeks, and they would continue building whatever this was between them. Yet, as Prudence finally turned to enter her clinic, she couldn't shake the feeling that things had irrevocably changed. For the first time in years, her future happiness was tied to someone else's safety, a vulnerability she had sworn never to allow herself again. The days following Matthew's departure passed with excruciating slowness. Prudence threw herself into her work, extending her clinic hours and accepting every house call, no matter how minor the complaint. Activity kept her mind occupied, prevented her from dwelling on dangers she couldn't control. Deputy Wilson proved himself competent, as Matthew had predicted. He checked on Prudence daily, sometimes with transparent excuses that told her Matthew had specifically instructed him to do so. Rather than finding this annoying, as she might have once, Prudence found it endearing evidence of Matthew's continued concern even from afar. A week passed with no word. Then, too, Prudence told herself this was to be expected. Matthew had warned her communication might be sparse. Still, each day without news stretched her nerves a little thinner. As the third week began, a telegram arrived from a town near the territorial border. It was brief, addressed to Dr. P. Miller and signed simply M. On their trail, all well, remember our last conversation. Their last conversation, his request that she trust him for as long as it took. Prudence pressed the telegram to her heart, relief washing over her. He was alive. He was thinking of her. It was enough for now. The following day brought unexpected visitors to Redemption Creek, a U.S. Marshal named Harrington and his deputy arriving on the afternoon stage. They came directly to Prudence's clinic after checking in with Deputy Wilson. Dr. Miller, Marshal Harrington greeted her, his weathered face serious beneath his gray mustache. "I understand you've had dealings with the Blackwell Gang." "I have," Prudence confirmed, studying the older lawman with growing concern. "May I ask why you're inquiring?" Harrington exchanged a glance with his deputy before answering. "We're part of a coordinated effort to apprehend the gang. Marshal Callahan was supposed to rendezvous with us 3 days ago in Copper Springs. He never arrived." Prudence felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you saying?" "We're not saying anything definitive, madam," Harrington hastened to clarify. "Callahan is an experienced lawman. He could have been delayed or found a fresher trail to follow, but given the dangerous nature of the men he's tracking." "You fear the worst," Prudence finished for him, her medical training helping her maintain outward composure despite the panic rising within her. "We're concerned," Harrington corrected, "and we hoped you might have information that could help us locate him." "Did he mention any specific places the Blackwells might go, any patterns they follow?" Prudence shook her head slowly. "He didn't share those details with me. Our relationship was still in its early stages when he left." Harrington nodded, unsurprised. "Professional to the end, that's Callahan." "Well, we'll continue our search. If you hear from him, please send word immediately to any telegraph office. They'll know how to reach us." After the marshals left, Prudence closed her clinic early, unable to focus on patients in her distressed state. Matthew was missing, perhaps injured. Perhaps worse. And she was powerless to help him, trapped in Redemption Creek while he faced danger alone. That night, Prudence made a decision. If Matthew couldn't come to her, she would go to him, or at least, she would go as far as Copper Springs, where he had last been expected. Perhaps there she could learn more about his movements, his intended route. The next morning, she approached Mrs. Porter with her plan. "You can't be serious," the older woman exclaimed when Prudence explained her intention to take the stage to Copper Springs. "It's a 3-day journey through dangerous country, and what would you do when you got there? Wander the wilderness looking for the marshal?" "I'd gather information," Prudence insisted. "Speak to the local law enforcement, find out what they know. I can't just sit here doing nothing, Abigail." Mrs. Porter's expression softened. "I understand, my dear, truly I do, but Matthew would want you safe, not putting yourself at risk for his sake." "Matthew would do the same for me," Prudence countered. "He rode after the Blackwell Gang partly to protect me from them. How can I do less for him?" Before Mrs. Porter could respond, the door to the hotel opened, and Deputy Johnson burst in, his young face flushed with excitement. "Dr. Miller," he called, spotting her. "Riders coming in from the South Road. One of them's the marshal." Prudence's heart leapt. "Matthew, you're certain?" "Yes, madam, but he's—" Johnson hesitated. "He looks injured, Doc, riding slumped in the saddle, and the men with him are supporting him." Prudence was already moving, medical bag in hand. "Have them bring him to my clinic immediately, and fetch Deputy Wilson, we may need help." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Matthew arrived at her clinic, supported between 2 men Prudence didn't recognize, fellow lawmen. She gathered from their badges and their respectful treatment of their wounded colleague. Matthew was conscious but clearly in pain, his face pale beneath several days' growth of beard. His left arm was crudely bandaged and blood had seeped through the wrappings. "Prudence," he said as soon as he saw her, his voice weaker than she had ever heard it. "I'm sorry to arrive in such a state." "Hush," she instructed, already helping the men ease him onto her examining table. "Save your strength." To the men, she added, "I need to examine him. Please wait outside." Once alone with Matthew, Prudence's professional demeanor took over. She cut away his bloodied shirt and the bandages beneath, revealing an ugly gunshot wound in his upper arm. The bullet had passed through the flesh, leaving an exit wound that was ragged and inflamed. "It's infected," she said grimly, gathering supplies to clean and treat the wound. "How long ago were you shot?" 4 days, Matthew admitted, wincing as she began to clean the wound. "We were ambushed near the border, got 3 of Blackwell's men, but Jonah's and 2 others escaped. And you've been riding with this wound untreated." Prudence demanded, her fear manifesting as anger. "You could have lost the arm, or worse, had to get back," Matthew said, his eyes never leaving her face despite the pain she knew her ministrations must be causing. "Had to make sure you were safe." Blackwell mentioned Redemption Creek before he fled, said he had unfinished business here. Prudence's hands stilled. "He's coming back. Here?" "Not anymore," Matthew said grimly. "The men outside U.S. Marshals, they intercepted Blackwell trying to cross back into the territory yesterday." "He's dead, Prudence. Shot resisting arrest." Relief and shock washed over her in equal measure. Jonas Blackwell is dead, Matthew nodded, then grimaced at the movement. His remaining men surrendered, it's over. Prudence resumed her treatment, applying antiseptic that made Matthew hiss between clenched teeth. You should have treated this wound properly, she scolded, though her touch remained gentle, or found another doctor. Wasn't any doctor between there and here, Matthew replied. And I wasn't stopping until I knew you were safe. The simple declaration made Prudence's throat tight with emotion. Well, I'm safe, she said briskly, focusing on bandaging his arm, and you're lucky this wound isn't worse. You'll need complete rest for at least a week, and regular cleaning and rebandaging to ensure the infection clears. Does that mean you'll be my personal physician? Matthew asked, a hint of his usual humor returning despite his weakened state. It means you'll be my most difficult patient, Prudence retorted, though she couldn't suppress a smile of relief. Now I'm going to give you laudanum for the pain, and then we need to move you somewhere you can rest comfortably. The hotel, Matthew suggested. Prudence hesitated, then shook her head. My quarters. I need to monitor you closely for the next day or two in case the infection worsens. Matthew's eyebrows rose slightly. That's quite a scandal in the making, Dr. Miller. Let people talk, Prudence said firmly. This is a medical necessity. With help from deputies Wilson and Johnson, Prudence got Matthew settled in her bed. She administered the laudanum and watched as he drifted into a fitful sleep, his face still drawn with pain even in unconsciousness. Only when she was certain he was resting as comfortably as possible did Prudence step outside to speak with the U.S. Marshals who had brought Matthew home. How bad is it, Doc? Asked the older of the two, a grizzled veteran named Collins. The wound is infected, but he's strong, Prudence replied. With proper care, he should recover fully. Man's too stubborn to die, Collins agreed with a nod. Wouldn't even consider stopping at any of the towns we passed. Said he had to get back to Redemption Creek, had to make sure his doctor was safe. His doctor, Prudence repeated, feeling warmth rise in her cheeks. Collins smiled knowingly. Well, he might have used your name rather than your title, madam. And he might have mentioned something about promises to keep. After the marshals departed, promising to return the next day to check on their colleague, Prudence returned to Matthew's side. He slept restlessly, occasionally murmuring words she couldn't quite catch. She bathed his forehead with cool water when fever rose, changed his bandages when blood seeped through, and administered more laudanum when pain brought him gasping to consciousness. Through the long night, Prudence maintained her vigil, dozing occasionally in the chair beside the bed but never truly sleeping. By morning, she was exhausted but relieved to find Matthew's fever breaking, his breathing more regular. When he finally opened his eyes, truly awake for the first time since his arrival, his gaze immediately sought hers. You're still here, he said, his voice rough from sleep and illness. Where else would I be? Prudence replied, moving to check his bandages. How do you feel? Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo, Matthew admitted with a weak smile, but better than yesterday. The fever's breaking, Prudence told him, her professional demeanor hiding the depth of her relief. The infection is responding to treatment. Matthew caught her hand as she straightened his blankets. Thank you, he said simply, for everything. Prudence felt tears threatening for the first time since his return. You gave me quite a scare, Marshal Callahan, she said, trying to keep her voice light. I know, Matthew acknowledged. But I kept my promise. I came back to you. Barely, Prudence pointed out, unable to suppress a shudder at how close he had come to not returning at all. But I did, Matthew insisted, his grip on her hand tightening slightly, and Blackwell is gone. He can't threaten you or anyone else ever again. Prudence sank into the chair beside the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past 24 hours. When Deputy Johnson said you were injured, I feared the worst, she admitted. I was planning to take the stage to Copper Springs to look for you. Matthew's eyes widened. You were going to come after me. Of course I was, Prudence said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. You came after me when I was in danger. Did you think I would do any less for you? A complex emotion crossed Matthew's face: surprise, tenderness, and something deeper that made Prudence's heart race. Prudence Miller, he said slowly, I believe I'm falling in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, unexpected yet somehow inevitable. Prudence found herself speechless, emotions she had kept carefully controlled for so long suddenly overwhelming her defenses. You don't have to say anything, Matthew assured her quickly. I know it's too soon. I know you need time. I just needed you to know. Facing death has a way of clarifying what matters. Prudence took a deep breath, steadying herself. Matthew, she began carefully, I've spent years building walls around my heart, trusting no one, depending only on myself. It was safer that way. Matthew nodded, his expression guarded as he waited for her to continue. But then you came along, Prudence went on, her voice growing stronger. With your protection that didn't smother, your respect that didn't waver, your patience that never faltered. You asked me to trust you for as long as it took, and I find that I do trust you more than I've trusted anyone in a very long time. She leaned forward, her hand still clasped in his. I don't know if what I feel is love yet, she admitted honestly. But I know it's more than I've ever felt before, and I know I want to explore it to see where it leads us. The smile that spread across Matthew's face was like sunrise after the longest night. That's all I ask, he said softly. A chance to show you that not all men will let you down. That some of us keep our promises. You've already shown me that, Prudence assured him, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to his forehead. Now rest, doctor's orders. In the days that followed, Matthew's recovery progressed steadily under Prudence's care. Word of his return and of the doctor's devotion to her patient spread quickly through Redemption Creek. Mrs. Porter took to delivering meals for both of them, her knowing smile suggesting she approved of the arrangement despite its unconventional nature. A week after Matthew's return, he was strong enough to sit on Prudence's small porch in the evening sunshine, watching the town go about its business while Prudence checked his bandages. The wound is healing nicely, she pronounced, applying fresh bandages with practiced efficiency. Another week and you might be able to return to light duties. Does that mean you're evicting me from your quarters? Matthew asked with mock dismay. Prudence smiled as she secured the bandage. I think the town has had enough scandal for 1 month, don't you? Besides, Mrs. Porter has been holding your room at the hotel. True, Matthew acknowledged, though I'll miss your company. You'll still see me every day for treatment, Prudence reminded him, and perhaps. She hesitated, then continued with newfound boldness, perhaps for dinner as well. When your duties and mine allow it, Matthew's expression brightened. I'd like that very much. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the setting sun paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was peaceful in a way Prudence had rarely experienced, the quiet contentment of being with someone who understood her, who respected her independence while offering his strength when needed. I've been thinking, Matthew said eventually, his voice thoughtful, about the future. Oh. Prudence prompted when he didn't immediately continue. The territorial governor was impressed with the resolution of the Blackwell case, Matthew explained. He's offered me a position as chief marshal for this region, based here in Redemption Creek but overseeing law enforcement for several counties. That sounds like a significant promotion, Prudence observed. Congratulations. I haven't accepted yet, Matthew said. I wanted to discuss it with you first. Prudence turned to him in surprise. With me? Why? Because it would mean staying in Redemption Creek permanently, Matthew explained. Setting down roots here, and that decision affects you, affects us, whatever us might become. The implication of his words was clear. Matthew was thinking of a future together, one that included permanence and commitment. A few months ago, such consideration would have sent Prudence retreating behind her carefully constructed walls. Now it filled her with unexpected warmth. I think you should accept, she said after a moment's reflection. You're good at what you do, Matthew. The territory needs men like you maintaining the law. And you, Matthew asked, his blue eyes searching hers. What do you need, Prudence? The question was simple yet profound. What did she need? For years, she would have answered with professional achievements, with independence, with respect for her abilities. Those things still mattered, of course, but now there was something more. I need someone who sees me as I am, she said slowly. Who values my strength rather than finding it threatening. Who protects without controlling. Who asks for my trust but also earns it day by day. She met his gaze directly. I need you, Matthew. I didn't expect to, I certainly didn't plan to, but I do. Matthew reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that made her heart flutter despite its old-fashioned gallantry. Then it seems we need each other, he said simply. And that's a fine foundation for building a future, don't you think? As summer turned to autumn in Redemption Creek, the town settled into a new rhythm. Marshal Callahan resumed his duties, now expanded to include oversight of neighboring counties. Dr. Miller continued her medical practice, earning respect throughout the region for her skills and dedication. And if the marshal was seen escorting the doctor to dinner more evenings than not, if they were observed walking together on Sunday afternoons, if his horse was frequently tied outside her clinic long after business hours, well, the town regarded these developments with approving smiles rather than raised eyebrows. By the first snowfall of winter, no one in Redemption Creek was surprised when Marshal Callahan was seen entering the jeweler's shop, or when he emerged an hour later with a small package carefully tucked into his vest pocket. Nor were they surprised when, the following Sunday, Dr. Miller appeared in church wearing a delicate gold band set with a single perfect pearl. What did surprise some, however, was the speed with which wedding plans progressed. Within a month, the church was decorated with winter greenery and ribbons, and the entire town gathered to witness the union of their marshal and their doctor. Prudence wore a gown of deep blue velvet, ordered specially from Denver. Matthew stood tall and proud in a new black suit, his badge polished to a shine on his chest. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, the celebration afterward joyous and prolonged. As they danced together at their wedding celebration, held in the hotel dining room that Mrs. Porter had transformed with lanterns and evergreen boughs, Matthew held Prudence close. "Happy Mrs. Callahan," he murmured, the new name still sounding strange and wonderful to both of them. "Very," Prudence assured him, her arms around his neck as they swayed to the music. "Though I'll still be Dr. Miller professionally," Matthew laughed softly. "I wouldn't have it any other way. Your patients need their doctor just as this region needs its chief marshal." "A formidable partnership," Prudence observed with a smile. "The most formidable," Matthew agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Who would have thought that your stubborn independence and my protective instincts would complement each other so well?" "Not I," Prudence admitted. "I was determined not to trust any man ever again." "And yet here we are," Matthew said, his eyes warm with love. "All because you took a chance on trusting me for as long as it took." "The best risk I ever took," Prudence said softly, "and one I'd take again in a heartbeat." As they danced beneath the lantern light, surrounded by friends who had become family, Prudence Miller Callahan reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a woman who had sworn never to trust men again to a wife who had found in one man the respect, the partnership, and the love she had never dared to seek, some risks, she had learned, were worth taking. Some men were worth trusting. And some loves were worth waiting for as long as it took. In the years that followed, Redemption Creek would grow and prosper under the watchful protection of its chief marshal and the healing hands of its beloved doctor. Their home on the edge of town would welcome 2 children, a daughter with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination, and a son with his mother's healing touch and his father's sense of justice. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's duties complete, Matthew and Prudence would often sit together on their porch, watching the stars emerge above the frontier town they both served and loved. In those peaceful moments, they would sometimes remember the beginning of their journey, her distrust, his patience, and the promise that had started it all. "Trust me," he had said. "For as long as it takes," she had. And it had taken exactly as long as it needed to know more, no less, for 2 independent souls to find in each other not a compromise of their strength, but its perfect complement.